Assalamu alaikum and good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's Shahrukh Hashmi. It gives me a great pleasure to be here at SOHO, Saudi Arabia. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me. And topic given to me today is CAR T therapy pricing and national regulations. I've got no disclosures. However, you may or may not be satisfied with what I'm going to present to you because at the end of the talk, I think you may have more questions than the answers that you were seeking for. So let's talk about the pricing for the CAR T cells. Now, before I go over the pricing, the um, the overall paradigm of stem cell therapeutics is important to understand because in the United States, there's a department that deals with the human cell therapy products, including regenerative medicine, but also in the EMA, this separate designation. And same thing in the UK and many other countries in the world and regions. For example, the ATMPs, Advanced Therapy Medicinal Products, is the terminology we use in Europe quite often for the same terminologies we use in the US. So, bearing that in mind, let's just go over the therapeutic paradigm of the stem cell therapeutics and the cellular therapies. As you know, in 1950s, when Don Thomas started the transplant, it was a novelty, and a lot of people questioned because the initial outcomes weren't that great. But persistence and refining the techniques and advancements in research has led to us today where we are, a massive field of regenerative medicine in which we deal with both the replacement therapies and repair therapies. And they're two different therapies. The transplant platform, which was the basis of the cellular therapies, is given in this article that was published in Science and Translational Medicine a few years ago by Christian Chabanon and colleagues. It's a beautiful chart that lays out the boundary of stem cell transplant and how we went out of the boundary to work on the different type of, on the top, for example, the immunotherapies in the transplant immunology, which are NK cell infusions, gamma delta infusions, which are alpha beta depleted stem cells or T cells, the CAR T cells and TCR gene therapies, which are coming up, infusion of antigen specific T cells, and we have got a lot more data of VSTs and TEALs and many other type of novel therapeutics which are developed. And suicide gene therapies, which was one of the earlier areas where we tackled in 1990s and 2000s. Malcolm Brenner at Baylor did a lot of sophisticated studies in using CRISPR-Cas9 for the suicide gene therapy for leukemia patients post allogeneic stem cell transplant. Infusion of depleted T cells, and obviously MSC field and placental cells and residual cells and many others. Actually, the whole field blossomed. At the bottom half, you see that the transplant was done for a lot of solid tumors and autoimmune diseases, still being done for some solid tumors, neuroblastomas, Wilms tumor, and a few others, but also for autoimmune diseases like relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis and advanced scleroderma. In fact, we did the first advanced scleroderma transplant at King Faisal some time ago. That was autologous transplant. And then stem cell therapeutics, non-hematopoietic, are just increasing over time in neurology, gastroenterology, pulmonology, and many other areas, but neurology is by far the largest field after hematology and oncology. And then obviously there's a lot of therapies, congenital therapies for which is being used. So all this spectrum is novelty, is true innovation actually, and it all started with the experts of stem cell, hematopoietic stem cells, which is the bone marrow transplant leadership. Now, before I go into the CAR T pricing, I want to mention that there's two examples, real-world scenarios, from which we may have learned some lessons and may not have learned some lessons, on the contrary. So let me give you an example. The first one is Glybera, and it was the first genetic manipulated product in the history. Well, it depends. It's eye of the beholder. If you ask ophthalmologists, they will say we have the Luxturna, the gene therapy for the retinal disease first, as one of the first gene therapies. But then you ask the oncologists, they will say that it was actually the melanoma vaccine that was that first genetically manipulated product. But in reality, it was a long time ago when we did the SCID gene therapy for ADA enzyme. So that was a very, very long time ago. And the original experiments happened in Boston for the SCID patient. And before that, obviously, in Pennsylvania, a long time ago, there was a big case of a patient who passed away because of gene therapy that was highly publicized in the media. But 2012 was when we first saw Glybera. It was approved, actually. It was actually for the LPL deficiency patients. The LOPA gene is actually a product which is genetically manipulated, which would actually do a replacement for the LPL. So that deficiency gets over with, and people do not have the clinical manifestations. And it was actually a successful trial by most of the gene therapy experts and the metabolic genetic experts in the world. So it was approved by the European Commission in 2012. So it's a big news for the world, actually, that finally either EMA or the FDA, one of them is approving a drug that can save lives of a small percentage because of a rare disease of people. But then what happened? After spending millions of euros on Glybera's approval, actually probably a lot more, hundreds of millions from preclinical phase until the approval, if you count in all the research that's behind it, the AMT, the company, went bankrupt and its assets were acquired by uniQure. But why did that happen? It was expected to cost around $1.6 million per treatment in 2012. I mean, inflation adjusted, that's a lot more money today, 10 years past. It was revised to $1 million in 2015, making it the most expensive medicine in the world at that time. In April 2017, the company that acquired, quit selling Glybera, uniQure announced that it would not be pursuing the renewal of the marketing authorization in the EU when it was scheduled to expire in October due to the lack of demand. I mean, a lot of factors playing the role: the regulators, the media, the physicians, the patient advocacy groups. There's a lot of factors. Very hard to pinpoint what exactly led to a demise of a drug that was supposed to be a blockbuster. Well, afterwards, the 3 million doses of Shazzy's inventory were actually given to the patients for $1, rather than 1.5 million, then $1 million, and then $1. That was actually a very big blow to the field of the gene therapy as far as the real world acquisition is concerned. Now, we don't have time for the Geron scandal, but the Geron drug that was made through iPSC, induced pluripotent stem cells, and given the spine, actually intrathecal injections for the patients who had a spinal cord injury. That whole division of Geron collapsed in California. It was a long time ago, actually, and there's a lot of lessons learned from that as well. So the question is, how do you price a novelty in healthcare? I'm going to ask this question to all of you on the call, virtually attending us online, both the regulators and the end users, and obviously all the scientists and physicians as well. Is it cost effectiveness analysis, the way NHS has been doing for the past decade, a couple of decades at least? ICER is the incremental cost effectiveness ratios. I mean, you do a cost benefit analysis or you do a cost effectiveness analysis. And ICER has the price of one drug minus the price of other drug. For example, if it's a drug therapy, one intervention minus the other intervention upon the value, which is the quality. But that's where the devil is in the details. That what defines a quality? Because it's different definition, different people. Or is it a market demand? It's a free market, right? And it's a competitive market too in the world. And the WTO laws actually do prohibit illegal distribution or sales of drugs which are not approved, or actually any product. But once it's approved, then each country can set up its own rule when it comes to healthcare. And a lot of that could be depending on market demand if the regulator is not regulating the prices of the drug. And this is true for many countries. Or should be outcomes-based. Now, outcomes-based is slightly different than cost-effectiveness analysis. I mean, you've got quality and you've got value in the ICER equations, but the outcomes-based, the way it's done is maybe a little bit different in today's world of value-based medicine. For example, a drug that's CAR T-cell, one of the first ones approved, is supposed to be given to pediatric ALL patients only if they can prove to show this particular outcome in a particular amount of time. Now, what is that outcome? Who decides which outcome should it be? Does that outcome make sense? That is the question. I'm going to come back to that actually in a little bit. Now, a second example, as I mentioned to you, I'm going to give two examples. One was Glybera and the other is Zynteglo. Now, you've heard of Beticel approval just in August of 2022 in the United States by the US FDA for the beta thalassemia patients, transfusion-dependent beta thalassemia that's made by Bluebird Bio. But let's just look at the history of this drug that all of you on the call may be aware of, actually. But my question is not that you know about what happened with the Beticel in Europe, but what happens next? That's the bigger question. What lessons should we truly learn? Well, so this is, as you can see, the EMA approves Zynteglo in the Europe. This is a very, very big news. First time a gene therapy approved for a hematological disorder, but also one of the very common diseases, thalassemia, which is much, much, much more common than the LPL deficiency, for which I showed the allopagene data, Glybera, which is out of the market now. No, it's Zynteglo. So it's actually not only is saving lives like allogeneic transplant, but it's not causing any GVHD. It's autologous stem cells actually genetically modify. I mean, you can use TALENs, you can use CRISPR-Cas9, base editing, prime editing, whatever method you want to use. But you actually increase the hemoglobin by a little bit, no crisis, no complications. I mean, it works pretty well for hemoglobinopathy. So this is a blockbuster news, really, really in favor. The EMA website shows this about Zynteglo. Afterwards, it's withdrawn from the Europe completely. Now, the Beticel, the same product that now we're going to be using in the US. In the Europe, this happened. Why did this happen in the Europe? I want to show you that some of the quotes which will make you think the two sides of a story, actually. Now, these quotes are from the company Bluebird Bio leadership. So after winning the approval for the drug in Europe in 2019, the company set up a price of 1.8 million on the one-time treatment for beta thal. You can do a million cost-effectiveness analysis or Markov models or different type of mathematical modeling or statistical modeling to show the long-term survival advantages of Beticel over continuing transfusions and different drugs or over allogeneic transplant. But at the end of the day, you got to make it work. You got to make it work by making sure that it goes to the people. People really benefit from it. The other quote, this quote is, European players have not yet evolved their approach to gene therapy in a way that recognize the innovation and expected lifelong benefit of these products. This is, again, the Bluebird Bio leadership. There's an element of European system that's frankly broken, the CEO, Nick Leshley, said. There wasn't one smoking gun from one country. This is about Europe. I mentioned that. So you can see that the issues eventually became pretty ugly. And these are actually public information. I got it from public websites, these codes. But they're two sides of a story, right? I mean, if negotiations fail, everybody points fingers to each other. But there's a lot more depth to what truly happens behind the scenes. Suffice to say, it did get worse. The CAR-T pricing. Now, the ICER is an other terminology for Institute of Clinical and Economic Review, which is not the ICER we talked about earlier on. This is an institute in Boston, Massachusetts. A 2018 study by this think tank indicated that the CAR-T treatments may be cost-effective, but at a threshold of $100,000 to $150,000 US dollars per quality adjusted life years. Now, who sets up the threshold? Who set up the original threshold of CALI in US for dialysis patients of $50,000? I mean, it's a group of scientists who do that, but the scientists don't disagree with the equation of ICER or the way we calculate cost effectiveness analysis that much compared to the what should be the CALI. It depends on a lot of variables, but the CALIs, simply put, are different for different countries. They have to be different because no country has the exactly same GDP and exactly same HDI, even age-adjusted and population-adjusted HDI. A 2021 study by Prime Therapeutics found that acquisition cost of CAR T cells to treat diffuse large B-cell lymphoma in pediatric, young adult, and adult patients was $373,000. But the real-world cost for payers could be much higher. If you put all the indirect costs, apheresis, all the things that go in the hospital, conditioning regimen, post-CAR follow-up, and then you put in the ICU cost for eye cancer or CRS, the cost could be much higher for an average of, like, for example, 50 CARs you're doing. For example, Mayo Clinic, if they're doing 150 CARs per year, on trial and off trial, the average costs could be much, much higher if one were to calculate the direct and indirect costs, typically double. So a 2020 study by Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center folks in collaboration with Juno examining the economic differences in autologous CARs by site of care and incidence of adverse effects. And it was really, really different depending on the adverse effect profile. And as I mentioned, ICANS is very, very hard to treat. It's becoming easier over time. We're preventing, we're getting much better and smarter in treating preventatively with TOSI and many other things that are being used right now for the CRS. But that was the biggest factor. The geographical distribution is different because, it's changed as we speak this month as well, because more countries are included. Saudi Arabia is included in here as well. And this is an older picture just to show you this is early days of CAR T therapy, the first 2 years. And right now we've got 6 products approved in the US, but this slide shows you the EMA and approval, Singapore, Japan, Canada approvals as well, besides the US for different indications. As you can see, mantle cell differs, there's Brexicell, but if you look on the left-hand column and then you put on the CARs approved for a particular disease, so myeloma, you've got ide-cel, cilta-cel, and recently we've got a paper for a totally different mechanism of a target for the CAR for myeloma as well. It's not BCMA, but for different diseases, more than one CAR is approved, some of them. But it's all hematologic malignancies. Today, we don't have any CAR approved for the solid tumors at the moment by US FDA. But make no mistake that focusing on the United States is a big mistake. I think the world is very big, and if you look at the approvals, you should look at how the Chinese agency approves the CAR T products, and they have a lot more CAR Ts than many other countries in the world. But the total cost of CARs, the affordability is influenced by effectiveness of the supply chains. I mean, supply chains are a big factor because in pandemic they proved to be either very successful or very unsuccessful. There was no middle ground, actually. Autologous stem cell therapies, they depend on the patient-centric supply chains because currently all of them are autologous products. There's none of the 6 products that I showed you were allogeneic CARs, actually. What the allogeneic CARs, the future, we don't know. Actually, it looks, we're going to hear a lot more in a couple of months in ASH and then in TCT and EBMT. but the trials are going on with the alpha beta depleted CARs, which are allogeneic products. And improvements in logistics, liquid handling in cell and gene therapy area contribute significantly to increase the efficiency, and vice versa. So that's why there are companies just formulated on the supply chain of cell and gene therapy today, focusing on that actually. And single-use support solutions for cell and gene therapy area could be very efficient. They eliminate biocontamination. There's a lot more actually that goes into supply chain, and we talk about this all the time when we're designing the CAR T trials, because we know how it works internationally now and what regulations are. A little bit we know, we don't know everything. We get surprised actually when the CAR trials are implemented in the world. But this is to show you just some costs of some of the CAR T cells in the United States. It doesn't have cilta-cel, which is actually one of the myeloma products, but I think the prices that you can see is pretty high. So the last couple of slides, the disruptive technology, ATMPs are truly disruptive technology. But my question to you is, what do they disrupt the most? We love the terminologies like, disruptive technology, blue ocean strategies. I mean, anything that's very fancy. I mean, people love to talk about those. But let me tell you my opinion on what they truly disrupt. And the answer is that they actually do initially, for the first few years, create a lot of more health inequality. And this is true for the overall utilization because of many reasons, and one of them comes its access itself. And we really don't know actually what the cost is going to be for the in-house on a clean sea facility, the Prodigy or the Cocoon. They both are given on the left and the right side respectively. A lot more rumors than the reality and the fact. So I wouldn't even bother actually guessing the cost of the product when it's commercialized. If it's not commercialized, then it's a different story actually. But so. With that, the trillion-dollar question is, should the ATMPs be priced according to cost effectiveness, market demand, or outcomes based? And the answer is we don't know. It depends on many factors. I'm going to show you the next slide actually. But if the outcomes based pricing model was already chosen for some CAR T cells, then median OS is not the primary endpoint. Then you've got to think again that what exactly should be the primary endpoint of a clinical trial like that. Median OS and PFS are not surrogates for all diseases. Myeloma, totally different, relapsing disease regularly, right? I mean, it keeps on relapsing after autos as well in CARs. But pediatric ALL, totally different disease. So you can't put both together. Single arm versus randomized trial, you heard what Dr. Richard Pastor from FDA said recently about single arm trials. So the answer is, how should the ATMPs be priced? It depends on the key opinion leader you ask, which is very unfortunate, how they influence the media and the world, and the regulator in the particular country, and the people, and the patient advocacy groups. So with that, I want to thank you all for listening, and happy to entertain questions in the panel discussion later on.